Quick, who do you think of when I say legal thriller? John Grisham, of course, and he'll be here to talk about his latest book, The Whistler.
It's a old-fashioned legal thriller. I have a corrupt judge and some corrupt people around her and some dead bodies and all kinds of good stuff.
How did the whole idea of special operations forces get started? Ben Macintyre will join us to talk about his new book, Rogue Heroes.
French, Belgian, Commonwealth, New Zealand, Australian special forces are all based on Sterling's original idea. So it has a legacy that really does run all the way down to today.
And we'll also talk about what we and other people are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. It's a great pleasure to have in the studio today John Grisham, here to talk about his latest novel, The Whistler. John, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
So
Thanks for
tell
having
us
me.
about the new book.
It's a old-fashioned legal thriller. There's no serious legal issue or story of social injustice or wrongful conviction or death, all the stuff I've been writing about for the past 10 years. It's just a pure suspense and a legal thriller, and set in the state of Florida. The backdrop is Indian casino gambling, which is a fascinating topic. It now exceeds regular commercial casino gambling in revenue and profits. Could be the rich source of corruption. So I have a corrupt judge and some corrupt people around her and some dead bodies and all kinds of good stuff.
So you can't help it. There are social issues in here. You've already mentioned several of them. You've got the Indian casino industry and all of the sort of social and political.
It explores the Indian casinos to a point. I don't make it an issue. I don't take it to task to say whether this is good or bad. Mm-hmm. I do point out that there are a lot of good things that have come from the Indian casino gambling. There also is a dark side, but I don't really explore that in the book. I just use it as a source of a lot of ill-gotten cash and the opportunity for corruption.
Did you go down to Florida? Did you spend time in the casinos down there? Or do you do research like that on the ground when you're conceiving of a novel?
Yes, not so much in this case because the tribe is totally fictional. The casino is totally fiction. It's all made up. I did get inside a casino. Not in Florida. I had some contacts to go inside and watch the security operations to understand how they count huge amounts of cash, how they collect the cash from the casino floor, how they guard it, how they actually film the professional counters who count the cash in a room. It's fascinating to me because the sums of money are so huge, and again, the potential is there to steal, to skim, to take some cash and put it off to one side, which is what happens in the novel.
So that's why the tribe is fictional. Legal reasons.
Oh yeah, I always worry about legal reasons, and doing the research, there's not a lot of corruption in the Indian casino gambling. So it's all fiction, I just made it up.
With most books, there is what we call a legal review, where a lawyer will go through it page by page and make sure there's nothing that could result in some kind of lawsuit. Do they do that with your books, or do you do that yourself?
His name is Neil Rossini. He's a lawyer here in Manhattan with a great firm that I have been with for over 20 years. And Neil does the legal review, libel review every year. He's my lawyer. Mm-hmm. And we're very, very careful. He checks every name. He checks every location. He checks everything. Then I get a lengthy report back from him, and he'll say this could be a problem. And I'll tell him up front, all this is fiction.
Right.
The judge is fiction. The tribe, the board on judicial conduct that I created in Florida. Every state has some kind of investigative agency that goes after or looks after allegations of judicial corruption. Every state does it. They're all radically different. I just made up one for Florida. And it bears no resemblance to what they have down there. But I said, that's fiction. This is fiction. The hotel is fiction. The casino is fiction. And once all that's fictionalized, the lawyer's happy.
Right.
And he goes after, this could be a problem. This could be a problem. It's a process that is not quick. And we do it because I've been sued so many times.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I've been sued I don't know, half a dozen times in the last 20 years.
For people seeing some kind of grain of some real-life case?
What often happens, there are so many people trying to get published and so many manuscripts floating around that eventually I'll write a scene or a character or something that resembles something that somebody else wrote 10 years ago,
right, and
couldn't get it published. So I will get a letter from the lawyer, and they'll claim that because Doubleday had this manuscript 15 years ago, that therefore I had access to it, even though the book was never published. Their book wasn't published. And we go round and around, and normally we scare them off. A couple have actually filed suit. I wrote a nonfiction book 10 years ago called The Innocent Man, and all of the actors are still alive. And we knew it was going to be trouble because the prosecutor, some of the police, some of the witnesses are not portrayed, in a good way. And so, sure enough, they filed suit. 3 lawsuits there. Again, I've won all these. We've never. We always win them on a motion to dismiss. We bounce them out pretty quick. But it's no fun getting sued, But you have to pay the lawyers. You have to go through. I've even given a deposition before with a room full of lawyers, which is not a good way to spend the day. Plus, I don't want to write something that could be defamatory and hurt someone.
Right.
I'm very careful about that. So so we go through the libel review every year, and we did with this book and changed some things. So that's very much a part of the process.
Did you enjoy that foray into nonfiction?
I love the story. Every story of a wrongful conviction can be a great book. A big, thick manuscript, because there's so many things to write about. There's so much suffering. There's so much misery. There's the fact that the real rapist is still out there, while somebody's serving his time. The issues are fascinating. Prison is a brutal existence. When you're guilty, when you're innocent, you go insane, because you should. All these, and what it does to the families, the victims. The victims' families are victimized twice. Once when the innocent guy is convicted, and then once he's exonerated. These are great stories. They take a tremendous amount of research, and I'm not really good at that. I don't want to spend time. I looked through 10,000 documents for The Innocent Man. That's not a good way I want to spend time. I can't say I won't do it again, nonfiction, because if I see the right story, I may go after it, but I certainly have no plans to.
Ian McEwan said before writing The Children Act, not his most recent novel, but the one before the current novel, that he spent a lot of time in family court just listening into these cases, and that it was incredibly rich source material for stories. You could find hundreds of novels in there. Do you find inspiration from reading the newspaper, reading legal cases, sort of following the news?
That's what I do. I don't go to court. By the way, that was a brilliant book, and you could tell that he had done his homework, as he always does. I love that book. I look at newspapers. I read the Times every day. It's my favorite newspaper.
He's legally required to say that on this podcast.
All sections. But I'm also looking for stories. The Innocent Man was a story handed to me by an obituary in the New York Times in December of 2004. I love the Times obituaries. And
we get a lot of our reading material out of that, too.
I got this book. There was a picture of Ron Williamson, who obviously had just died, and he was standing in court. He was my age, my neck of the woods, Arkansas, he's from Oklahoma. Same religious background, same socioeconomic background. He was a first-round draft pick of the Oakland A's, baseball with the same age. I'm thinking, how'd this guy end up on death row? And there was a picture of him after 11 years in prison, the day he was exonerated, standing in court, looking. The look on his face was like, he was surprised, he was angry, he was whatever. And I stared at that picture for a long time, the photograph. And I read the obituary, which was written by Mark Dwyer, I think that's his name now. And I read it twice, and I said, I got to write this book. And I called my publisher here in New York at Doubleday, and I said, have you seen the Times? He read the obituary, and we talked later, and I said, that's my next book. I've never done nonfiction. And within an hour, I had tracked down. Ron Williamson left 2 surviving sisters, one in Tulsa and one in Dallas, and I had managed to get them on the phone, and that began an 18-month process that was fascinating. I had no idea what I was doing, but I loved the story. And that came straight from the New York Times obituary. And if I'd skipped the paper that day, I would have never written the book.
Right.
Because I'd never heard of the case. Mm-hmm. Just that one moment in time when I saw it, if I hadn't seen it that day, it would have been gone forever.
I hope our obit writers are listening. Did you learn anything from that experience of writing nonfiction that you then brought to your subsequent fiction?
I don't know about the actual process of researching and writing. I'm not sure much of it changed. I felt very constrained by the facts and the research and getting it right and accurate because I wanted to tell the story. It's an angry book. There's no effort to be fair because the story's not fair. This guy was mistreated by the system from the very beginning. And so when I started writing the book, I was telling his story, and you can't be fair to people who are not, who are playing bad roles here. And so, but I'm not sure I learned anything as far as, writing fiction. Fiction is so much more, it's so much easier. You create your own dialogue. You can't, in nonfiction, you have to go back and recreate dialogue.
Right.
And that's very tricky.
In fiction, you get in trouble for it being too real.
Yeah, too real, but you also have to be plausible. It has to be, it's fiction, it can be whatever you want it to be, but it has to be realistic.
You obviously mostly write legal thrillers, but you've, in addition to the nonfiction, have stretched in other ways, recently writing a number of children's books. Why did you decide to go into writing kids' books, and do you get something out of that writing experience that you don't from your adult fiction?
After a number of books in a certain genre, I think by nature you just start thinking, okay, I've had a lot of success here. Can I do something else? Can I stretch a little bit here and stretch a little bit there and try to write a different book? The first time I did it was a childhood memoir called A Painted House that was published, 15 years ago. I then tried, I love humor and comedy, and so I wrote a book called Skipping Christmas, which was my first effort to be just as funny as I wanted to be. Love sports, so I wrote a couple of football books. So, yeah, I mean, the older I get, the more books I write, the more I want to write, and the more different types of books I write. About 7 years ago, my daughter, she's a school teacher, and she had a group of fifth grade students, and she was really emphasizing reading. And over dinner one night, she asked me if I could write suspense for kids. I never thought about it. And she said she can find a lot of stuff for kids, fantasy and historical fiction and mystery or whatever, adventure, but she was having trouble finding some really good suspense. So I took it as a challenge and created this character that Theodore Boone, I've now written 6 of those books, and they're a lot of fun. It's about a 13-year-old boy, and for me, when I was 13, it was a great year. Just one of those magical times when I was a kid that I had a really good school year and had a lot of fun, a lot of friends. And so Theo has become my alter ego at the age of 13. I think he'll always be 13. But
it's an interesting decision to have to make, whether to age a character like that along with the readers. Or
tremendous,
to keep them.
Yeah. And I'm, after 6 books, I'm beginning to ask myself, can I sustain this for a long time? I would like to, but you can only have so many wild adventures when you're 13 years old. So I'm facing.
Nancy Drew did a good. She was 16 for a long time.
Yeah, the Hardy Boys, 85 books. I'm not sure I can do that, but it's. I'm not writing one this fall for next year. I plan to write one next fall for the following year. Is
part of it, do you have any kind of goal in that writing to teach kids about the law or get them excited about or passionate, aware of issues?
Very much so. There's a lot of law in these books. Theo, both of his parents are lawyers, and he thinks he's a lawyer. And he loves to go to trial. He goes to the courtroom, watch trials, hang out with judges and stuff like that, and policemen. And in doing so, I sort of carefully define and explain certain things about the law. And it's very gratifying to get letters from kids. I've also had 2 or 3 letters from judges who had a class of kids in court one day, and it was a field trip. The kids came in to watch a trial. The judge met with them afterwards, surprised at how much law they knew because they had read the Theodore Boone books. And that's very gratifying.
When you write your books, do you think about, in addition to the general readership, do you think about your sort of fellow legal professionals and worry that if you do something, they'll be like, oh, a real judge would never say that, or that doesn't actually happen that way? Do you try to keep it authentic to the law?
I do, because I really dislike watching a TV show or a movie where they don't get it right. And I can read a book written by a book about the law, a trial, a law firm, whatever, and I can tell almost instantly if the writer is a lawyer. You can just spot it. You can just tell. And I really get frustrated watching TV when things are all wrong.
They mess up things about the news media, too, crazily.
Yeah. But so I keep that in mind. At the same time, I want it to be accurate. I'm going to get letters, whatever I write, from lawyers and judges who say, okay, you got this wrong. Well, okay, I know that. I know I got it wrong. I don't really care. The vast majority of my readers don't know that. Mm-hmm. I do try to keep it accurate. For example, in this book, the whole thing is a whistleblower, and thus the title of Whistler. And I'm not sure the Florida whistleblower statute in any way resembles the one I created. Mm-hmm. So I do rewrite laws all the time to make them fit.
Going back again to this book, the new book, The Whistler, one of the issues that it does deal with is corruption, as you said earlier. And that's a theme that you've returned to again and again in all of its myriad ways. Why do you think, what draws you to the idea of corruption, and is it especially rich material for a legal thriller? That's
it. It's the material. It's a story. It's a conflict. It's people behaving very badly, and that's what. And most lawyers don't do that. We talk about judges. We have a remarkably clean history when it comes to judicial corruption. There's so little of it. That's good, compared to other countries. We've had very few cases in this country where the judges were actually taking cash under the table. Nothing like the character I created. She's taken millions. But again, it's fun to read about. You've written so many of these legal thrillers. Do you set up a particular challenge for yourself with each book, something you want to do different, something you want to accomplish or try out? And if so, what is it for this book? And there are certain times when I pick an issue, whether it's judicial elections, which was a novel several years ago, or the death penalty, or insurance fraud, or homelessness, or wrongful convictions I've hit on several times. For example, right now I'm thinking about the issue of student debt. Mm-hmm. It's tremendous in this country and how so many of these kids have been allowed to borrow more than they should have borrowed by, and encouraged to do so by schools that promise too much. It's now over $1 trillion, and it's a huge problem. And so I'm doing research now on that, to think about maybe a novel about that subject matter. So yeah, I kind of plan these. However, with The Whistler, it started with a character. I like the idea of a young, attractive, smart female lawyer whose job it is to investigate allegations of judicial corruption, and to keep her. I didn't kill her off, so she can come back maybe for another book. She'll come back and deal with the student debt. Well, maybe. You never know. All right. Readers can look forward to both The Whistler and feature novels about student debt or other issues. John, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for having me. My pleasure. The book is, again, The Whistler by John Grisham. During World War II, a British soldier named David Sterling assembled a team of highly trained infantrymen who carried out secret, dangerous missions behind enemy lines. Ben Macintyre joins us now from London to talk about his new book, Rogue Heroes, The History of the SAS, Britain's secret special forces unit that sabotaged the Nazis and changed the nature of war. Ben, thanks for being here.
Great pleasure.
For those who don't have the book in front of them, the cover shows this great image of the SAS soldiers of the title with sort of mugs of, probably whiskey at 9 a.m. and cigarettes and sunglasses and hats askew. And they look roguish, appropriately.
They certainly do. They certainly don't look like they're in the army, do they? They look as if they're about to, which they are actually, about to sort of carry out mayhem.
So readers know you from your many books, A Spy Among Friends being the most recent one about Kim Philby, Double Cross, Operation Mincemeat, Agent Zigzag. How do you get your stories?
The espionage stories, many of them come from the sort of change of heart on the part of the sort of British establishment that decided to begin releasing its sort of confidential and secret files from the war. I mean, those are very much sort of based on archival material. And this new one is much the same in a way, although it doesn't come from the same sort of source. This this one came about because the SAS, the Special Air Service, which is the sort of mythically secretive sort of special forces wing of the British Army, actually approached me and said, would you like to write an authorized history based on the archive, which no one had ever been in before. No historian had ever been allowed into it. So it took me about 30 seconds to say yes to that offer.
So that's the SAS War Diary that he was referring to?
It's not just the War Diary. The War Diary is the sort of central artifact in many ways, which was a sort of collection of original combat reports, photographs, letters, all that sort of stuff, which was sort of formally gathered at the end of the war and then kept in secret. But the archive is actually much, much bigger than that. And it contains everything, really, that the SAS gathered about its own wartime history. And it's not just documents. It contains letters, poems, postcards, diaries, handwritten memoirs, guns, parachutes, everything. I mean, really absolutely everything. And it was all brought together at the end of the war and simply put in a room and more or less sealed up.
And who decided to release this information and when exactly and why?
Well, it was a decision made by the SAS themselves. I think it was based on a number of factors, really. It was partly because this is the 75th anniversary of the founding of the regiment, partly because both MI5 and MI6, our equivalents of the FBI, broadly speaking, and the CIA, decided to open up their files some years ago and have authorized histories. And the SAS was really the last remaining kind of bastion of secrecy, really, in terms of sort of wartime history. And I think they also felt, and I rather applauded this, that there were so few living figures left from that era that this was a way of sort of paying tribute to the few survivors.
And what's the reaction been from those survivors to the book?
Most of them extremely pleased. I mean, they are really only a tiny handful of men left now who fought in this unit during the Second World War. And I think most of them feel very pleased, actually, that the full story has finally come out. I mean, this is, and I emphasize this is an authorized history. It's not an official history. So in that sense, it doesn't reflect the views of the SAS itself. What it reflects is my views about what is in the archive and what that story is about. And to the SAS's credit, they have not tried to change that history or to censor it or to sort of mold it in any way at all. I was authorized to go in. What came out in terms of my writing was entirely my own.
All right. Well, in 10 minutes or less, tell us what came out. What?
Okay. Well, I mean, it is an extraordinary story. I mean, this was a group of really sort of semi-renegade officers and soldiers who were in the North African desert in 1941. At this period, it was really a period of stasis in many ways because the British Army was locked in combat with Rommel's Afrika Korps across the north coast of Africa, and nothing was really moving. And it was the brainchild of a man called David Sterling, who was the most unlikely leader of a special forces team. I mean, he was extremely unfit. He smoked and drank a very great deal. But he had a kind of an extraordinary sixth sense for battle, really. And he worked out, while recovering from a parachute jump in a hospital bed in Cairo, that actually this vast empty desert in Libya was a great opportunity, and that if he could get behind the lines, behind the German lines, there were targets of opportunity, most notably the airfields strung out across the Libyan coast, that could be attacked, and then they could melt back into the desert. And so after an initial sort of catastrophic operation, which was called Operation Squatter, where he lost very nearly half his men in a sort of failed parachute jump, he then changed tactics and realized that he could drive into the desert some 580 miles and then kind of come up behind the German lines with a new kind of bomb that they had invented called the Lewis bomb. They would creep onto the airfields at night, plant these bombs on the various planes, parked there, time bombs, and then disappear back into the desert before these things exploded. And that is duly what they did. It was an extraordinary operation. They carried out a whole series of lightning raids across the North African coast and destroyed hundreds of planes. And more importantly, in a way, not only did they degrade the Axis air power over the Mediterranean, but they sowed a kind of sort of panic into the kind of Italian and German forces there, who never knew when Sterling and his sort of turbaned raiders were going to turn up. And so lots and lots of sort of soldiers were redeployed to defend the airfields who would either otherwise have been operating on the front line.
So for listeners who are not familiar with the nuanced differences between various units in the armed forces, what was it that made the Special Air Service different from the traditional British military force?
Well, at the beginning of the Second World War, a lot of officers were veterans from the First World War, for whom war was a pretty static kind of operation. You had two armies that would meet on a battlefield and then fight it out, often with trenches, until one retreated and one emerged victorious. This was a completely different idea, and it sounds sort of obvious to us today that you would attempt asymmetrical warfare. But at the time, it was extremely controversial, the idea that you would send in small units of highly trained saboteurs, effectively, to destroy communications and railways and ammunition dumps and anything that you could find behind the lines as a way of degrading the enemy. That was highly controversial, and many officers within the British sort of high command were deeply opposed to Sterling and his raiders. They thought, in the phrase of the time, this was just not cricket. What happened was that they were so successful that it actually spawned really a new way of looking at war, which has become today the kind of accepted method of warfare. Obviously, its techniques and its technology have changed over time, but the essential idea that Sterling came up with, which was that you would attack behind the lines, is exactly what British and American special forces are today doing in Iraq, Syria, and back in Libya.
You mentioned that the British High Command was initially opposed to the SAS and its tactics, but Churchill was an early fan of this kind of thing.
Well, Churchill, it turned out, and again, this was something that was revealed from the archive, Churchill really saved the SAS. I mean, the SAS was in serious trouble at one point, and the top brass were itching to disband it. They referred to it as a sort of a thuggish group of raiders. But it was Churchill himself who intervened to save it. And of course, Churchill had a brilliant grasp of the drama of war. I mean, Churchill was an extraordinary military commander in many ways, but he understood that the romance of war is actually very important, and that what was really needed in the desert at this point of sort of stasis was a kind of romantic, swashbuckling story. And he saw in Sterling and his team an opportunity to do just that. And he met Sterling at a dinner party, believe it or not, in Cairo. Churchill was on his way to visit Stalin in Moscow, and he stopped off in Cairo, and there was this dinner party to which Sterling was invited. And Sterling told Churchill the whole story of the SAS. And Britain's wartime prime minister was just intoxicated by this. I mean, he found it tremendously sort of thrilling, and he effectively signed off on a sort of blueprint that Sterling drew up as a result of this meeting, in which Sterling kind of explained what the SAS was about. And it was a sort of power grab on Sterling's part to put all special forces under his command, and it worked. So really, without Churchill's support, it's doubtful whether the SAS would have survived at all.
I'm curious about the kind of people who joined the SAS. Sterling came from an aristocratic background. Was this like the rugby team of armed forces? Were these sort of young aristocrats, or who?
Well, no, I mean, some of them were. Some of them were sort of, as it were, out of the top drawer, I mean, Sterling included. But no, they were an amazingly mixed bag. I mean, Sterling was a very good judge of character. I mean, he was a most eccentric man himself. He was sort of 6'4" and very gangly and rather shy. But he was beloved by the men, and he set out deliberately to gather together a kind of an odd mixture of people. I mean, they were by no means all aristocratic. As one soldier put it to me, he said, we were the sweepings of the public schools and the prisons. And they were people who did not fit into a conventional army. They were adventurers who were looking for a particular sort of romantic challenge. But I mean, I make it sound as if it was some sort of boy's own paper adventure. It was the life expectancy of an SAS soldier in the desert in 1941 was very short. But they covered the gamut. There was an ice cream maker, a solicitor. There was a rugby player. There was a famous international rugby player called Paddy Mayne who played for Ireland before the war. But they came from every single walk of life. But they shared a kind of set of traits that Sterling was very careful to identify. He said, I do not want people who are psychotic. I want people who are...
It's a minimum requirement.
Well, it was actually... Well, he did get quite a few people who were sort of borderline psychotic. I mean, they weren't all very straightforward figures, but he wanted people who had a kind of lateral thinking edge. He wanted people who could adapt to very fast-changing circumstances on the ground. He wasn't remotely interested in spit and polish and the kind of normal strictures of army life. In fact, he wasn't even terribly interested in rank. I mean, he was forever promoting people unofficially and saying, I think we're going to make you a lieutenant, and never getting around to telling anyone officially. So he wasn't very interested in sort of hierarchies, but he was very interested in this kind of bonding mechanism that takes place between men in circumstances of extreme danger.
You start off the story, with the founding of the SAS and end it in 1945, and there's a kind of like rise and fall trajectory within that time frame. They started off with the Operation Squatter, which was a huge disaster. Then they got much, much better, and then things turned again. And
one of the ironies of the SAS story is that in a way their most sort of dangerous enemies were not on the battlefield, but actually at staff headquarters from people who wanted to see them disbanded. And as you say, they were disbanded in 1945. It was decided that with the dawn of the nuclear age, the need for these highly specialized combat saboteur and units was really over. Of course, they could not have been more wrong, and it only took 2 years to realize that actually in the post-war world, this kind of asymmetrical warfare was going to be more important than ever. And so the SAS was then reformed again 2 years after the war and has been on active service ever since. And it has an important international legacy, the SAS. I mean, your U.S. Delta Force was based specifically on SAS tactics. A particular American officer joined the SAS on secondment and saw what was happening and actually went about modeling the Delta Force entirely on that idea. And it spread around the world. French, Belgian, Commonwealth, New Zealand, Australian special forces are all based on Sterling's original idea. So it has a legacy that really does run all the way down to today.
I guess the only appropriate answer then is thank you for giving us that. And
it's a pleasure. I wish I could claim credit for it myself.
Ben Macintyre, thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Ben Macintyre's latest book is Rogue Heroes, The History of the SAS, Britain's secret special forces unit that sabotaged the Nazis and changed the nature of war. My colleagues Greg Coles and John Williams join us now to talk about what we are reading and what other people are reading. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, let's talk about the other people first, Greg. What's new on the bestseller list? Anything good?
Yeah, one notable newcomer on the hardcover fiction list this week is a first novel by a writer named Britt Bennett. The book is called The Mothers, and that is new down at number 15. It's been getting some very good critical attention and good word-of-mouth buzz. It is a coming-of-age story in a black community in Southern California, and there have been profiles of the author, and it's getting some good buzz. So that's already on the list at number 15.
Alexander Alter profiled her, of course, in the Times a couple of weeks ago, and she's reviewed as well in this week's issue. And
new at the top, John Grisham, who was just on the podcast, his new novel, The Whistler, is right there at the top of the hardcover fiction list. In nonfiction, the highest-ranking new title is Tim Tebow's memoir, Shaken, talking partly about being cut from the Denver Broncos and just other setbacks that he has faced in life, and how shaken is a reference to his Christian faith, that his faith was shaken from these setbacks, but not broken. He's come back strong, and now he's playing professional baseball in the Mets Farm League. The other maybe notable title this week is by Pat Conroy, who died this past March. There is an essay collection called A Low Country Heart that gathers eulogies that he wrote, blog posts that he kept on his website, things like that. It's just various essays by him. That's new at number 11.
The collected blog posts just does not roll off the tongue.
It's also the second time we've talked about eulogies being collected recently. Wasn't
Yeah,
it really enough
Bill
book?
Buckley. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
It's an odd form.
Right, who is still hanging on there at the bottom of the extent of the list at number 16 with a torch kept lit. Actually, what comforts me this week is there are a lot of good literary fiction titles on the hardcover fiction bestseller list. There is The Underground Railroad, of course, Colson Whitehead's book, The Mothers, as you mentioned, Today
Maria
Will Be
Semple's
Different
still on there,
by
yep.
Maria Semple, and then we have
Anne
Commonwealth.
Patchett.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
all good things to be cheerful about in these dark and alarming days. So, John, what are you reading? Anything cheerful?
Not cheerful, but really good.
Okay, we'll take it.
I was on vacation last week, and I packed, the 7 or 8 books that I normally do stupidly, and I ended up reading a couple of them that are fairly slim. They're both novels by Anita Bruckner, who I mentioned earlier this year on the podcast. And it seems like every year there's an author I find who I end up sort of proselytizing for, especially that year, and I think she's the one this time. The first book that I read was called Brief Lives. It's about 2 women friends, Faye and Julia, and it's narrated from Faye's perspective. And Julia is this sort of, icy beauty. There's this great line where she says, Julia was very beautiful, but she was devoid of softness. Her beauty was of a dry, immaculate kind, the kind that never deteriorates. And the book opens with Faye having just read Julia's obituary in the Times, and the London Times, that is, and it reminds her of their friendship. And so then she sort of unspools the story of how they met through Julia's husband and the very complicated relationship they had, including a secret that Faye keeps that I won't spoil. But she's just an incredible writer on a psychological and sentence level. And so then I followed that up with Hotel du Lac, which was her Booker Prize-winning novel from the late 80s. And it's funny because this is also very good. It's about a romance novelist who goes to this hotel, and it sort of talks about both her life and the people she meets in the hotel. It didn't impress me quite as much as the other books of hers I've read this year, and given the fact that it won the Booker, it kind of reminded me of Ian McEwan's Amsterdam in that way, which is it was sort of a prize given to her after many books that people really loved and admired, but maybe isn't considered widely her best by people.
What sent you into this Bruckner spree?
My friend Andy Miller, who's a British writer who I had acquired a book of his back in my book editing days. And
Is that Andrew Miller for those who just
no,
looked at
there
book
are like
jackets?
19 Andy Miller. He actually has a really funny essay about his name and how common it is. There are about 19 Andy Millers in
Because
the
there's a new
literary
Andrew
world.
Miller, I think, coming out in the spring.
Yes.
That's the other Andrew
And there's a
Miller.
book editor,
he's
Andy
not the one who
Miller.
pitches for the Cleveland Indians.
But this Andy Miller is very active. He wrote a book called The Year of Reading Dangerously, which is terrific. And he's very active on Twitter, and he started tweeting these sort of images of paragraphs from her books. And that's what really got me started. But I'm glad.
I'm thinking about the genesis of the John Williams, Andy Miller friendship and the fact that you both have names that...
Right, we can't be distinguished or searched
That's
easily
right.
on Google. Greg, what are you reading?
I'm reading a book partly spurred by some of your earlier reading, John. I know that earlier this year you read Jane Eyre. And
See, we're friendly and competitive.
I'm reading a book that I had never gotten around to, and it's Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, the Caribbean-British writer. It's a book that is kind of the backstory of the Mad Woman in the Attic from Jane Eyre. It goes back to her upbringing in Jamaica in the fall of the fall of slavery, and it's very much a kind of anti-colonial and pro-feminist novel about the political pressures that lead the Mad Woman in the Attic to becoming mad. I also turned to it partly because GQ magazine recently did something I saw on social media. They approached 25 contemporary writers and said, what are the overlooked novels that people should be reading? And Wide Sargasso Sea did not turn up on that list. It's not overlooked at all. It's quite famous. But 2 other books by Jean Rhys did turn up on that list. She was the only writer who was represented twice in the list.
To sort of circle this back, she might be Andy Miller's favorite writer. And so
This is the Andy Miller podcast. Thank you for joining us.
he has his own great podcast. So he had tweeted about a book called Goodnight Midnight. I don't know if that was
That
I think
might have
that's
been
what it's
one of
called.
them, yeah.
And that might have been one of them, which I actually left me a little bit cold. And then I did start Sargasso Sea after I read Jane Eyre, but I got distracted from it, so I have to go back at some point.
I went through a little phase some years ago of reading these kind of updated or spin-offs of classic works. Peter Carey has a novel called Jack Maggs that is all about the character Magwitch from Great Expectations. John Gardner did a take on Beowulf that was completely from the monster's perspective, the novel Grendel, great book. So this is something that's been done, but I think Jean Rhys was one of the first of the contemporary writers to kind of seize on the idea of spinning off her own version of one of the classics and doing it from a kind of political slant.
Pamela, how about you this week?
I am still reading Hamilton, but I will talk about different aspects of it because I have moved along. So I've been going through the kind of French-heavy phase of the book where it's the French Revolution. And it's so interesting to read about it from this perspective and from Hamilton's view of the French Revolution, because I had studied the French Revolution in France, where it looks very different. And it's all about, les citoyens, like, it's very romantic. It's like, sure, there was blood shed, but, it was all in the cause of fraternité, liberté, égalité. And Hamilton does not see it that way. And when you look at the plain facts, you can kind of see why, Robespierre and the Reign of Terror and all of that. But there's a little amusing episode that I thought I would share. This is from a chapter on Citizen Genet, who is a colorful figure, very worth reading about in his own right. Here's Chernow writing about the period shortly after the French Revolution begins. Most Americans had applauded the French Revolution as a worthy successor to their own, a fraternal link renewed in August 1792 when the National Assembly in Paris bestowed honorary citizenship upon George Washington, N. Madison, and Jean Hamilton. When Hamilton received a letter from the French Interior Minister confirming this, he scribbled scornfully on the back, quote, "Letter from Government of French Republic, transmitting me a diploma of citizenship, mistaking the Christian name. Curious example of French finesse." So I love that. As Jenny Schuessler reported in the Times this week, there is an auction coming up of newly discovered Hamilton memorabilia, including a lot of letters and private notes. And I'm really curious about that, too, because one of the things that, at least thus far in Ron Chernow's biography, becomes clear is that the relationship between Alexander Hamilton and Angelica Church, one of the Schuyler sisters and his wife's sister, is not all that clear. You don't know if they actually had a physical relationship. It's much more heavily alluded to in the musical version than it is on the page. There were letters that Hamilton's son sort of redacted parts of between the two of them. So I wonder if any new correspondence between them will come to light in that auction.
It's interesting. I'm always looking for sort of good, wondering if there is a particularly good narrative summary of the French Revolution to read. So maybe off air, you and I will talk about your studies in France.
Yes. The other thing that I'm noticing a lot this week is, of course, parallels to the current election. Although I feel like you could be reading, a Snoopy celebration at this point and finding things about Trump in there. But it is interesting to read about grassroots rebellions in the early republic, like the Whiskey Rebellion, and the way in which they, really went after violently people who tried to collect taxes on spirits in Pennsylvania. And anyway, you
Hard
can
to believe,
just draw the line.
Pleasant to believe that by the time we talk next week on this podcast, the election will be over.
What will we talk about?
Well, I feel especially good for you, Pamela.
We're going to have to talk about White Sargasso Sea or something. All right. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks,
John.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.